So, Acts is pretty cool. I don't know if you're digging it or not, as you're reading through it. I love it. In the last few, weeks, Paul's ministered in Corinth, and then he's gone to Antioch and Ephesus and Greece and Troas, to Miletus, back to Ephesus. And then he feels like the Lord says, you need to go to Jerusalem. And what's interesting is that the Lord had already said to him in his heart, you're going to testify about me in Rome. You're going to testify about me in Rome. And so he says, well, I'm going to Jerusalem. And he's on his way. He's making his way back from his different missionary journeys where he's going. And he's on his way back to Jerusalem. And as he's on his way back to Jerusalem, he stops in a place called Caesarea. And I'm going to tell you right now, in Israel, if you ever get a chance to go, and by God's grace, I'm winning the lottery just maybe even tonight. I'm just kidding. I'll have a lottery ticket for tonight. But by God's grace, I'm winning the lottery someday, and I'm going to take you all there. This won't be a castle. This will be a 747, and so you'll still be sitting in pretty much the same seats. And we would have rented it out. And we'd be going to Israel. We get to Israel, we're going to go to a place called Caesarea by the sea. It just sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Sounds even more beautiful in the way that the Romans called it, Caesarea Maritima. Doesn't that just sound awesome? And so there we were, you can stand right there at this huge, there are ruins now, but there's this humongous auditorium that's there that Herod built so they could have concerts. And I've been there in years past when Whitney Houston was going to be there the night before, or Phil Collins had just left from the night after. And it's like just gorgeous. And as you're sitting in this huge theater, from behind you see these beautiful green ocean with the lights and it's gorgeous. And Herod built this thing so that he could entertain the people. They had a hippodrome there, and where they did the chariot races, and then they had parts where they could cut it off into sections where they could have gladiator games, and there's all this stuff that's there. And that was really in the days of Jesus. Caesarea was the capital of Israel, of the whole Roman conquered Israel. Really, Caesarea was the capital. Jerusalem was and will forever be the spiritual capital of Israel. But in the days of Jesus, Caesarea by the sea was the real capital. That's where the Romans were. All the shipping came in right there through Caesarea by the sea. Herod built swimming pools, and he built these huge levees, and he built this huge place where ships could come in, a harbor, where they could come in and be safe. And he just did all this amazing work. And the Romans built aqueducts to come into Caesarea. It was amazing. It was also an amazingly pagan city. And every time you got off the boat to go in there, you had to bow down and you had to pay homage to these Roman gods. And of course, Caesar himself claimed to be God. There was a guy you'll hear about later you heard about in the Gospels, named Pilate. We remember Pilate. And Pilate was the Roman governor. And when he first came in, all the other governors had been so nice to the Jewish community, because they said, hey, you can put your standards of Caesar here, your graven images of Caesar and your marble statues and all of this stuff, but we don't believe in graven images, right? Because that's number 2. Especially graven images of some guy named Caesar who considers himself to be a god. And so you can do what you want to do. It's just that there's one place where we draw the line, says the Jewish community, and we don't want any images of Caesar in Jerusalem. And when this guy Pilate shows up, what's he say? Who are these Jews? Are we not the Romans? Are we not running the show here? So at nighttime, when nobody was looking, he had all his troops come in on the day that he shows up to Jerusalem for the very first time, and all of his troops come in. And then when the lights come on and the morning shows up and the Jews wake up, they look around, and what do they see all over Jerusalem? Standards to Caesar. Well, they didn't cotton to that very well, and so they started to protest, and here was their protest. 500 men laid in the courtyard of Pontius Pilate. They laid down on the ground, and they would not get up for 5 days, refusing to get up. And it so freaked out Pilate that he said, if you don't get up on this 5th day, I'm going to kill every one of you. And the leader said this, we would rather die than have these standards of Caesar and these images of this false god in our holy city. And so Pilate's like, okay, wait a second. Now I'm faced with people who will die for their beliefs, right? And so he backed off. If you understand that, then you understand better how a group of Jews can get riled up at the trial of Jesus and how he could cave to the influence of a bunch of Jews. You understand what I'm saying? Because he knows the power, and in Jerusalem at Passover, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jewish people there, not 500. You also understand why it was his custom at the Feast of Passover to do them a favor by letting a prisoner go. See? So they couldn't have all this stuff in Jerusalem, but they had it all at Caesarea by the sea. So as Paul's on his way back, he says, I'm going back to Jerusalem. I have some things to do. I have a vow to fulfill before the Lord. I have to purify myself. I'm going to seek the Lord. The Lord has already said to him, you are going to testify to me in front of Caesar in Rome. And he gets to Caesarea on his way to Jerusalem, and we read about it yesterday in Acts chapter 23. And we found out that as he's on his way, starting at chapter 21, not 22, there's warnings about the journey to Jerusalem. And a guy says, listen, they're all praying in the Spirit, and the Spirit told them the way that Paul was going to be led into captivity if he goes to Jerusalem. And so they were advising him, because of what the Spirit had revealed to them, don't go. Well, listen, the Spirit wasn't telling them that Paul shouldn't go. They were filling in the gaps on behalf of the Spirit, because we oftentimes as Christians don't have the capacity to understand Christians' suffering. That a Christian who does everything that he's supposed to do or she's supposed to do and is following God exactly the way he has called them to follow him, that he in his good grace would literally lead them into hardship and difficulty and maybe even lead them into martyrdom. So when we, by the power of the Spirit, see that somebody might be going through suffering, we say, well, God would never want any of his servants who love him to suffer. So therefore, we have to dissuade Paul. But Paul had confidence knowing what the Lord had called him to do. And he's kind of like, thank you, I know I'm going to have tribulation. By the way, Jesus was promising that back in what? Back in John. I promise you that in this life that you will have troubles and trials and tribulations as believers. And there's some sections of Christianity that don't believe that. They believe that if you're having hard times or if you're sick or if your finances aren't what they should be, that the problem is with your faith. They don't have the capacity to even comprehend the idea that God in his graciousness and his great wisdom would lead people who were doing exactly what he wants them to do. He would lead them directly into suffering. Otherwise, how would we understand Romans 8:28? God works everything together for the good. Why would we even need that exhortation if it wasn't to be that sometimes we suffer, but that ultimately that suffering is for good? And that's hard for us, okay? I try to avoid suffering at every turn. I don't want to suffer for anything. I don't want to get up and get anybody anything at my house from the fridge. I don't want to mow anything. I don't want to clip anything. I don't want to wash anything. I do all those things, but I don't want to. Anything that makes me uncomfortable, I don't want to do in the flesh. But in the spirit, I say, well, I'm the leader here. And if the leader's not willing to work, well, then how should everybody who's supposed to be following him be motivated to work? Speed of the leader, speed of the team, right? So I want a fast team, so that means I got to get up and I got to be fast, which means sometimes you have to suffer, and that suffering is ultimately for good. So here's Paul. He's been warned, don't go to Jerusalem. And what happens? He goes to Jerusalem, and lo and behold, he gets into a big old fight, a big old scrap, and they're about to kill that dude. And all of a sudden, a Roman guy comes in, an officer, and saves him. And the religious Jews have pretty much, the Sadducees, the ones who controlled temple worship, have pretty much convinced the Roman centurion guy to let Paul go into their hands. Paul perceives that, hey man, in just about a minute, my life is going to be taken at the hands of these Sadducees. Then I'm going to be sad, you see. And so my life is going to be taken at the hand of these Sadducees. And what does he do? I'm a Roman citizen. And that was a showstopper, because that Roman centurion definitely did not want to be guilty of putting to death or allowing a group of religious Jews to kill a Roman citizen under his watch. And I appeal to Caesar. And I like what the Lord says to Paul in Acts 23, verse 11. This is all the preamble getting into, and then we'll understand what's happening. Acts 23:11, he says, "But the following night the Lord stood by him. Be of good cheer, Paul, for you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." Can I drive home a point before we even get into the text tonight? If God has told you that you're going to testify about him at Rome, you are not going to die in Jerusalem or anywhere else between here and Rome. So no matter what else happens to you, you're not going to die. Why? Because the word of the Lord said, you're testifying to me about me in Rome. And that gives you a boldness to move forth. If you have certainty from the word of the Lord, did you know that God has given us a similar promise? He has said to us, hey, listen, you're not going to spend eternity in an alley in San Bernardino. You're not going to spend eternity in Moreno Valley. You're not going to spend eternity in Riverside, California. Why? Because Jesus has gone to prepare a place for me. And if he's gone to prepare a place for me, then he's surely going to go back and he's going to take me to the place that he's prepared for me. So if I'm sharing the gospel in an alley in San Bernardino and some guy knives me, which is a high probability, and I lay dead there in an alley in San Bernardino and they draw a chalk line around me and a guy's eating a sandwich and another guy's taking pictures, or Moreno Valley or Riverside or anywhere else in the world, even if they kill you, that's not where you're spending eternity. Why? Because he's gone to prepare a place for you. And he says, and if I'm going to build this thing for you, I'm definitely going to go get you and put you in it. And then you'll spend all eternity with me. The question is, do you believe that? I like what John Piper said, which is, do you live your life in such a way that it would be utter foolishness were there no resurrection from the dead? And if you don't really believe in the resurrection of the dead, if you don't really believe in the hope of eternity with the Lord, then you will live your life trying to get all that you can of this world. But if you realize that your home is not in this world, then you can say, well, what do I got, 80 years? What's 80 years compared to eternity with the Lord? What do I have to suffer in this world? Then I'll do it. Mike Tyson says everyone's a fighter till they get hit. I take a Krav Maga class. I've told this before. I'm trying to make myself look tough. I'm not tough. You know this. Israeli street fighting. I take this class every Thursday. And I don't want to go on Thursday, this coming Thursday. Why? Because we were sparring, but we were kind of doing open-handed sparring. So we're sparring, and the partner that I was sparring with, hit my thumb in such a way that the instructor said, "Stop, I heard that pop." This is my thumb. But it still hurts, and it's Tuesday, and I'm thinking, will it be hurting on Thursday? Do I really want to go spar with this guy again and then further injure my thumb? Because this is half of a pick holder, and I make a living playing the guitar. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I even want my fighting class to be comfortable. How jacked up is that? Time out, time out. Could somebody get me a Sprite? Sprite for Mr. Wiggins. No, I'm okay, just kidding. But the point is we live our lives in such comfort. If we really don't have an idea, really, I think we got to stop and really ponder and ask the Lord to really allow us to meditate and to ponder on how great that eternity is going to be. We're not a culture that wants to wait. Greg Laurie says we yell at the microwave for being too slow. We don't want to wait around. And yet, what would 80 years, I'm just saying, well, that's a pretty long life, but what would 80 years be compared to eternity, that we would live ourselves as servants? As I said, Mike Tyson says everyone's a fighter till they get hit. But I've heard a theologian say everyone's a servant until somebody treats them like one. Nobody wants to be treated like a servant. And I think ultimately it's because we don't have a real healthy understanding and expectation of eternity. Therefore, we're still trying to get as much of the world as we can gather around us to make this 80 years that we have as comfortable as possible. And what happens is, if that happens, then you get so caught up in this world that you become no good for the kingdom. The Lord's like, what can I do with you? You're lukewarm. In a few months, we're going to read about a church in Laodicea, and we'll find out what the Lord does with lukewarm churches. Now here we are in Acts 24. Paul went to Jerusalem. He got arrested, just like the guys had prophesied would happen to him. And yet he knew that God had a plan. And God says, indeed, I have a plan. You're not going to die here in this prison. You're going to testify to me in Rome. And sure enough, he goes to Caesarea by the sea. Now, is he in Rome when he's at Caesarea by the sea, that beautiful place? No. So that means that no matter what Paul says in Caesarea by the sea, are they going to kill him? No. They're not going to kill him. Why? Because God promised that he's going to speak in Rome on the Lord's behalf. How empowering is that for us to know that this world is not all that there is, and that this life that we have is not all that there is, and we can let it go. It takes such a high amount of trust in order to let go of the world, and I wish I could say that I've done it, but I haven't. I still have handfuls, and I've got bags full of the world. That the Lord continues to convict me to say, let's open up this bag and shake it out. Because I want you to empty yourself. If it's a distraction for you, Stephen, I want you to move forth, and I want you to be bold, and I don't want you to cling to this world. Because that's my testimony to the world, that I can raise up a people who aren't of it and aren't influenced by it. You know, both Democrats and Republicans hate one thing: an honest politician. They hate him because they can't be bought, and they can't be bribed, and they can't be influenced. And the essence of politics is compromise. And what we're about to see is Paul before a couple of compromisers. He's now finally brought there. He's got to wait around. He's got to stand on trial. Acts chapter 24, verse 1. Now, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain man named Tertullus. Got him a lawyer there. And these gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he called upon Tertullus, began accusation, saying, seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix. Really? Wasn't that you guys just a few years earlier that were laying down in a courtyard saying we'd rather die than have Rome here? Attorneys. We have any attorneys in the room tonight? Two buzzards sitting by the road. One buzzard says to the other one, "Hey man, I'm going to go down there and eat out of that dead cow carcass." And he's like, "That's a little too much even for me, Hal." And he goes, "Yeah, but I just ate a lawyer and I can't get the taste out of my mouth." I could tell lawyer jokes all day. He's buttering up this guy. He says, "We accept it always," verse 3, "and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness." But that's not true, because within a few years, 30 years, I believe, there's going to be a huge Jewish revolt. And the Romans are finally going to say, "You know what? Forget these Jews. They're going to tear down the temple. They're going to rout them out of the country. And the very last significant battle is going to be on the top of a hill called Masada, which ended with all the people on top of Masada committing mass suicide except for one guy who killed himself. Killing murder against each other except for one guy, and he killed himself. And the idea is that it's against the Jewish law to commit suicide. So they cast lots, hundreds of them up there. They cast lots, and each man killed his wife and his children. And then they cast lots to find out who was going to kill who, which man was going to kill which man. And it came all the way down to the last two guys. And the last guy kills his friend, and then he kills himself. So out of all the 100 plus or whatever, how many people were up there, only one guy actually committed suicide, and that's the one which fell by lot. So ultimately, there's going to be a huge Jewish revolt. But now here, we know this because we know history. Within 30 years, there's going to be a huge revolt. But at the moment, he's saying some things which, let's just say, are consistent with attorneys sometimes, defense attorneys, but aren't necessarily consistent with the truth. So once again in verse 2, "And he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight. We accept it always in all places, most noble Felix, and with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, do not be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of a sect called the Nazarenes." Now you have to understand history to understand what a dirty term that the Nazarenes would be for the Romans. Okay? Back in when the Seleucid Greeks were running the world, a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes was a conqueror who made his way into Israel. And he made his way into Jerusalem. And he defiled the temple. Epiphanes means manifestation of God. He declared himself to be God, and he stood in the temple. He was a picture of Antichrist to come. One who eventually the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, and one will stand in that temple declaring to be God and will cause what they call an abomination which leads to desolation. So here was this man predicted in Daniel chapter 8. It was actually happening some years later, and this guy Antiochus Epiphanes is doing this thing, defiling the temple, tried to sacrifice a pig on the altar, not sure if he actually did it, desecrated all the oil in the temple so that the menorah couldn't burn, and a family rose up called the Maccabees. And this Maccabean family rose up and they routed the Seleucid Greek army, greatly outnumbered. And so it was a miraculous victory. And their courage to fight, these Maccabeans, their courage to fight came from the words of the prophets. And they believed in the prophets. And so once they routed the Seleucid Greeks, they walked into Jerusalem, and there was only enough oil for the menorah to burn for one night, but it takes 8 days in order to consecrate the oil. And so it set up what we know of as the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Got it? Once they came back into control, they said, why stop with Israel? Why stop with the Greeks? And so then they started to force Judaism on the Edomites and set up what they call the Hasmonean dynasty, which then later Rome came in and took control, and ultimately Rome was now in control. So the last time that the Jews had revolted and came up, a Messiah, as it were, Judah Maccabee, was the one who led them. Okay? Eventually, the Maccabees broke up into two factions. One faction was called the Pirushim, which means the separate ones. They were separated. And that was the religious faction. It's where we get the word Pharisee. The Pirushim, the Pharisee. Okay? The other half of the Maccabees was what they called the Zealots. The militant faction was the Zealots. And where do you think that they lived? They lived up in the northern Galilee. In the same place where Jesus did 80% of his ministry. Places like Capernaum, all the way over into Nazareth, all the way moving all the way up. And so this is where they were. And so when now an attorney from Jerusalem shows up and he's speaking in Caesarea by the sea, and he goes, yeah, these are a sect of Nazarenes. Now you understand. Barabbas, a Nazarene. A guy from the northern Galilee who was a rebel, who was a murderer. They were just known to be like that. It's like East LA. It's just like they're just kind of known. And so therefore, he's casting dispersions against this sect of Nazarenes. You see, what he didn't know, and how could he anyway, this attorney, Tertullus, great name. What he didn't know was that back in Acts chapter 10, you guys remember that? We taught it right here. Back in Acts chapter 10, sorry, I've totally got that wrong. Where was it, 15? I'm losing myself now. It was 10, yes? Oh, I'm sorry, I was in Mark 10. That's the problem. A guy named Cornelius saw a vision. Do you remember that? In Acts chapter 10. Cornelius sees a vision. He's praying in the 9th hour. You remember? I taught it just like 2 weeks ago. No, it wasn't last week because we're on 24 now. So 10, 2 weeks ago. And Cornelius sees a vision. Hey, there's a guy down in Joppa, and you got to call for him, and he's going to come up and he's going to tell you something. And at the same time that they're almost at his door, God gives Peter a vision. Hey, there's some guys from where? From Caesarea. A guy named Cornelius, who's the head of the Italian regiment. Okay? When Rome would come in, conquer a nation, it's just kind of like right now where you have Americans in the Middle East, and we're training up Afghan soldiers so that eventually they can take over the governing of their country. And we're training Iraqi soldiers so that eventually they can take over their country. When Rome came in, they would train up, they'd have a Syrian regiment, and they would have a Egyptian regiment. They'd have a Jewish regiment. And then, but this guy, Cornelius, was from the Italian regiment, which means he was one of the pros from Rome. And this guy Cornelius, the Bible says in Acts chapter 10, Peter shares the gospel with Cornelius. Cornelius and his whole household believes. And if he's a centurion, then he's over 100 Roman soldiers, which means that I would think that not a few of them, but probably many of those soldiers under him heard and believed the gospel. It's amazing how God goes before us. And he makes a way before us and we don't even know. Peter, when he's sharing the gospel with Cornelius and he's watching the Spirit fall, and all these Jewish guys that went with him, the Bible says those from the circumcision, meaning religious Jews who had converted or believe in Jesus as the Messiah, all these guys are blown away that the Spirit of God is falling on these Gentiles like this, and Romans at that. And they think to themselves, this is amazing. This is what God is doing here. Well, yes, that is what God was doing. But what else was he doing? He was making it possible so that years later, Paul's going to be standing on a trial and a lawyer from Jerusalem is going to walk in and he's going to go, hey, listen, this guy belongs to the sect of the Nazarenes. Bunch of rebels, and they're turning the whole world upside down. Just give him back to us and let us kill him. But what does the governor know? Sect of the Nazarene, that's what Corny. Corny, you believe in that thing, don't you? You've been turning the world upside down? No, you haven't. As a matter of fact, you've been a lot better. You were good. You were good, dude. You were good, but now you're way good because of this guy. You see how the Lord goes before us? All we have to do is not make a way for ourselves, but all we have to do is just faithfully follow the Lord. In years in advance, the Lord is going ahead of you. There was a guy named the Gadarene demoniac. Remember this guy? Jesus says, hey, what's your name? They're like, we are legion, for we are men. There's like 1,000 demons or something like that inside this guy. The Bible says that Jesus healed him, and then the guy comes and catches him at the boat, and he's like, hey, take me with you. Do you guys remember the story? And what does Jesus say? No. Go to your own people. So in that we realize what? This guy wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile. How else do we know that he was a Gentile? The Bible says, then he went throughout the Decapolis. Deca means 10. Polis means city. The 10 Greek cities. And the Bible says he went around the Decapolis spreading the news of who Jesus was. There's your first Gentile evangelist. Was this guy. What's he doing? Years in advance is preparing the people for the concept of the Messiah and his power to heal and his power to have dominion over all evil spirits. God goes before. Did you know that there's places where he's probably telling you already in your heart that he wants to send you, and you say, I would go if I saw a way. Hey, the way is that he called you to do it. That's the way. And just you trusting that he's going before you and he's making the way. And so here's Paul standing there, and this guy's saying these things about Jesus and Christians. And here's this guy over here, head of the Italian regiment, who just not long ago converted. Isn't it amazing how the Lord goes before us? Remind yourself of that the next time you're feeling like, I can't. It never hurts to go back to the Lord and say, I don't know that I heard this right. I'm not really good with directions. You know this. Tell me again, do you really? I don't think he doesn't mind that dialogue. He doesn't like the skeptical dialogue. I know you told me to do that, but you know that's not right, God. That will never work. He hates that. But he doesn't mind, hey, I don't know that I'm hearing you correctly. I'm willing to do what you're calling me to do, but just, Lord, continue to affirm that in me as I move forward, because I don't see the way yet. And I'm really afraid of your character, that I'm going to be the one who's a martyr. That's really what we're afraid of in the end. I'm going to be the one who gets great glory, and I never get that promotion. And I lose my house. And I lose my friends. And now here I am in the world with nothing but God. See what I'm saying? And that's how we throw the pity party for ourselves. Pull the streamers. Psst. Hey, nothing in God is better than, what does the Bible say? What profits it a man if he gains the whole world, but what? Loses his soul. I'd rather have my soul in the Lord than the world. I think where we end up falling is, okay, I want the soul in the Lord, but I do also want the world. How much of that can I get and you be happy with me, Lord? And the Lord's not against nice things. He's not against you having money. He's not against you having pleasure. It's just that the love of money and being consumed with money, those are the things in life that is sin. Having it, hey, we need it. I took up an offering. You got to have some money because we got to pay our rent. So having money is no problem. And you don't have to give it all away. God gives you nice things. We're all dressed very well compared to most of the mission trips I've ever taken. So we got a lot of treasure. And I think we have to continue to be reminded of how luxuriously we have it. Do you feel the air conditioning yet? It's a luxury. We're in a castle. Give me a break. Verse 5, for we have found this man a plague and a creator of dissension among all the Jews, not what Cornelius says, throughout the world, and a ringleader of a sect of Nazarenes. You know them. They're the guys you hate. And he even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him, wanting to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding this accuser to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. Not just all the Jewish people, but the Sadducees, those who controlled the temple worship. You know what they didn't know that he had? Number one, they didn't know that he had Cornelius over here. Personal friend of mine, Cornelius, who believes in this sect of the Nazarenes, which you say is so disrupting. Tell you what else that they didn't know that he had was a little thing called a letter. You ever heard of a letter? It's where you write something down and you give it to somebody and you want to really write your thoughts down so that they can accurately understand what it is that you were trying to say. It's called a letter. They used to write them before we had email and texting. Well, in the previous chapter, Acts 23, starting with verse 26, what did he have there? Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. Oh, he had Lysias' side of the story. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him. That's very different from forcefully wrenched him from our hands while we were trying to do a good deed. Having learned that he was a Roman, Tertullus didn't happen to mention the fact that he was a Roman citizen, did he? And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. And I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told to me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you. I also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Isn't it interesting? He's sitting here and he's holding this letter, and this guy's going on about this big deal, and he's telling his side of the story. But what does he have? He has a letter directly from the guy who's being accused, and his name's being defamed. The Lord goes before. Amen? Verse 10, then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, he answered. You ever watch Judge Judy? It used to be Judge Wapner, and now it's Judge somebody else. I don't really know who it is, and I don't want to know that you know. But it's Judge somebody. And it's all the cross-talking. It's the asking him a question, and then he's jumping in the middle of it. It's like, I can't stand it. I also can't stand most of the shows on Fox for the very same reason. It's what my wife calls the yelling channel. Steve, turn off the yelling channel. Because it's one mediator, supposedly, and then it's the right view, because they're supposed to be fair and balanced, and then it's the left view, and they're all yelling at each other and over. And I like Paul's demeanor. It's like all these accusations. It reminds you of who else stood on trial? Jesus. It reminds you of Jesus, doesn't it? And all these accusations are coming, and he's just standing here. I suppose there's a time to be angry, but in negotiation, they say that anger assassinates authority. Anger assassinates authority. That's why when you watch The Godfather, and you look at like the Don Corleone kind of guy, you know what I'm saying? It's like these guys are getting so agitated in front of him, and he's sitting there just eating the spaghetti. But it's like when he talks, it's just riveting the calm that he brings to the, you know what I'm saying? It's good drama. It's good TV. I don't even know if that's the way Goodfellas really are. But I know that in the movies, that's the way they are. And it's, to me, that's way more fearful than the guy who's a crazy maniac. You know what I'm saying? It's a guy that's so calm and calculated. And I just see Paul standing there as this guy's giving this big oratory, and it's already stuff he doesn't even know about the revival, which Paul obviously knew about, because Paul had traveled there, right? That was where they told him, don't go to Jerusalem because they're going to do bad things to you. When Paul comes back in chains, don't you think that a bunch of his church friends are like, see, I told you. You should have listened to us. It's like if I had listened to us, then I would still be here teaching a Bible study with you guys, and I wouldn't be standing about to give the gospel to this guy. God's plan was I'm going to share the gospel with a Roman governor. So here he comes back up. Finally, Paul speaks. Then Paul said to the governor and nodded to him to speak. And he answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship." How can he ascertain that it was no more than 12 days? Because 12 days ago, he was right here in Caesarea by the sea. We can pick that up in Acts chapter 21, verses 1 through 16. It doesn't take you long to ask around here in Caesarea by the sea that I was here. And not only was I here, but I was conducting myself in a civil manner. Perhaps he was even meeting with Cornelius. So you talked to Peter, did you? Verse 12, "And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, neither in the synagogue or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law, or the Torah, and the law and the prophets." And what's interesting is in that day, they had two factions. They had the Pirushim, right, the Pharisees, and they had the Sadducees. Sadiq means righteous. I am at the end of some words makes it plural. So Sadducees means the righteous ones. You had the separate ones, and you had the righteous ones. Okay? The righteous ones, the Sadducees, are the ones who are holding him on trial right now. They controlled temple worship. They believed in the Torah. They believed in the law and the way that Moses prescribed to worship. The Pirushim did believe in the law, but they placed most of their faith and belief in the words of the promise, of the hope of a coming Messiah, which they get from the prophets. So that's why they say the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, right? So they're Sadducee. And the Pharisees believe in the resurrection, but they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So they fairly see, right? So when Paul is on trial, you have both Pharisees and Sadducees, and they're both ganging up on him. A Roman soldier comes in. What just separates the room? He says this, "The only reason why I'm on trial right now is because I believe in the resurrection of the dead." It's as if we had Presbyterians and Pentecostals, and they were all trying to get me. They're trying to jump me right now. And there's half Pentecostals and half Presbyterians. And I said this, "Hey, listen, the only reason that I'm on trial right now is because I believe that we speak in tongues." And what happens? He splits the crowd. All the Pentecostals say, yeah, that's right. You do speak in tongues." And all the Presbyterians are like, "No, that died out back in the days of the apostles." And then all of a sudden they start fighting. "I'm going to get you." And Paul's like, "Hey." That's what divided him in the first place. That's why the Roman had to come in and rescue him. And now what's he doing? He's making the very same defense. He's trying to get the rile up inside of the Sadducees who were there to accuse him. That's why he brings it up again. Hey, listen, I confess you this. According to the way, which they call a sect. Remember, Jesus said what? "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no man comes to the Father but through me. Because of the way, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the Torah and in the prophets." I believe everything that Sadducees believe in. And I was raised a Pharisee, so I believe everything the Pharisees believe in. I have it the best of both worlds. Because I know Messiah, he has brought all things unto himself. So I believe in the Torah, so the Sadducees can't accuse me. And I believe in the prophets, so the Pharisees can't accuse me. I am complete in Messiah, and they are lacking without him. You can't have just prophets and no Torah. You can't have just Torah and no prophets. In Messiah, I'm made complete. And in him, I worship the God of my fathers, believing both the law and the prophets. Do you understand? The magnitude of what he's saying is humongo. So the Hebrew word, it means big. It's like a humongous statement that he's making right there. I was in a place called Lucille's on Saturday after I taught at the synagogue. Lucille's is a wonderful Jewish restaurant. You get more barbecued pork than you'd ever imagine. I will admit I was having a chicken sandwich, but I'm not kosher by any means. So I'm at Lucille's, and there's an older lady by my wife, sitting on a table next to us, and my kids just said, "Hey, listen, she has the same purse as you, Mom." And Misty looked over and saw her and said, "Oh, yeah, that's right, I do." And so then the lady goes, "What are you looking at?" And she goes, "Oh, I have the same purse as you." And she's like, "Oh, great, that's great." And she said, "Well, wow, are these all your kids? You look so young." And then they looked at me and they go, "You look old enough." No. But so we started talking. I said, "Well, what are you doing out here?" I said, "Well, I live in Riverside, but I teach at the synagogue down the road." And she's like, "Oh, I go to synagogue. What synagogue do you go to?" And I said, "Shuva Yisrael." She's like, "Shuva Yisrael, Return Israel. What is this?" And I said, "Well, Return, God of Israel, God of our fathers." And she goes, "Well, are you Orthodox? I've never heard of this synagogue before." I said, "I'm Messianic." She goes, "Oh, so you're not a real Jew." I said, No, I'm Jewish." I kind of took a step back in my mind. I was like, I don't want to have to hit this lady. I would never do that. She's like 4'10". She looked like my sister. I said, "No, I'm Jewish." She goes, "Well, my rabbi told me that Messianics aren't real Jews." I said, well, why is that? And he says, "Well, I thought that they were all just Gentiles who were playing like they were Jews." I said, "No, there's like 200 Jews who believe that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah." I said, "Witness to this lady right here." She goes, "How can that be?" I said, "Well, here's my card. You should check it out." There we were in the middle of Lucille's. God goes before you. Right? The point is this. Even today, the Jewish community looks at Jews who believe in Jesus. They understand why the Gentiles cannot get it because they weren't raised in the faith and they don't have. But they don't understand how a Jewish person could believe in Jesus. And that's Paul's statement exactly. They call it a sect. I'm telling you, it's the way. Not a way. Here's a way. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, all ways. They say all roads lead to God. I believe that. But they lead to the judgment of God. The real question is, which road leads beyond? Everybody's going to die. All the dead will be resurrected. Believers and unbelievers. Everyone is resurrected. Unbelievers unto judgment. Believers unto eternity with the Lord. So everyone's going to be resurrected. The real question is, what happens if you stand before the Lord? And he says to you, "Hey, why should I let you into my heaven?" What would your answer be? Is your hope built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, as the song says? Or are you still trusting in yourself to try to figure out a way? "Oh, I'm really good with gab. I'm going to get up there and I'm going to get the Lord laughing. I'm going to start off with some jokes." No, there's only one way. And so Paul says it rightly. I belong to the way, not a way, the truth, the life. The one in which no man comes to the Father except through Jesus. And hey, listen, that's true today too. He says, "I confess to you that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers." And that's the thing, it was hard for this lady to wrap her mind around because the rabbis had told her all these things about Messianic Jews. And I'm sure that some of them in certain contexts are true. But I don't know that she'd ever walked up and met a real one. And by God's grace, that's what we got to do. Have a little conversation right there. Verse 15, "I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust." Well, if they're Sadducees, they don't. And so once again, getting under the rile of them, which they also believe in. Right, boys? And now they have to make a statement, which their statement is what? It's like an IRS chief. They don't say nothing. It's true. Verse 16, this being so, I myself always strive to have a good conscience without offense toward God and men. Do we do the same? Verse 17, now after many years, I come to bring alms and offerings to my nation. Hey, I'm here to support the economy, boys. And in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. And they ought to have been here before you to object if they have anything against me. Basically, the first guys who jumped on me that had a problem with me are guys from places like Ephesus, guys from places like Corinth, right? See, Asia is not like we think of Asia today. We think of Asia today, we think of Vietnam, we think of China, we think of Japan. But Asia in Bible times was like modern day Turkey. Okay? Almost part of Europe right there. Upper Mediterranean, other side of the Mediterranean Sea. That's where he went. You can take some tours called Footsteps of Paul tours. So you go to Israel for a few days, but then you get on a cruise ship. Sounds like fun to me. And then you sail up around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and you're making your all the way up to Rome because you're following the way. But when you get up there by Turkey, and you get to Ephesus is in Turkey, I believe, you get up there, what happens is we've already been reading about the stuff that was happening down there. He'd be in there preaching their synagogues for 3 or 4 days, and all of a sudden some guys would get up here and they'd say, hey, this is that guy Paul, and he's teaching a heresy, and all of a sudden they'd beat up Paul and they'd kick him out of town, and he'd go, okay, where am I going to go next? Okay, back to Thessalonica, right? Preaching here, what happens? So what happens is he's in the temple, and some guys from Asia see him. Guys from places like Ephesus and Thessalonica and Corinth and all these other places where he's been preaching. And they're really hot on him. They're really angry at him. They're the ones that first are the responders. Then they tell the leaders, then the leaders gather around him, and the guys from Asia, what? They just kind of back off then at that point. And then all of a sudden what he's saying is this, hey, the guys who had an issue with me, number one, there was no issue, but the guys who did have an issue, they're not even here anymore. Nobody here can remember why it is that I'm here. But here I am in court. Now, after many years, I also came to bring alms and offerings to my nation. Verse 17, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. And they ought to be here before you to object if they have anything against me, or else let those who were here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, why? Because he had a letter and because he knew a guy named Cornelius. He adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I'll make a decision on your case. So he commended the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty. Go wherever you want to go. They put an ankle bracelet on him, checking with his parole officer every now and then, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide or to visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul, and he heard him concerning faith in the Messiah. And now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call you. And meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. Why? Because Paul mentioned earlier, I came to bring what? Alms and offerings for the nation, that he might release him. He wants a little under the table from Paul, and I'll let you go. But what did Paul know? The Lord has told me I will testify in Rome. I've appealed this case to Caesar. And while giving this guy some of these offering money might buy me my freedom so I could do some more ministry around here, ultimately, I would be a Jonah because I wouldn't be going where the Lord had called me to go. The Lord has me here, has me in chains so that I can go to Rome and I could testify before Caesar. There's a man that knew his mission. Do you know yours? Meanwhile, he hoped that the money would be given to him by Paul, that he might release him. And therefore he sent for him more often and conversed with him, not to learn the truth, but to maybe find Paul in that moment of weakness where finally he's like, can I just give you some money and get out of here? But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix. And Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Hey, do you know what the Jews weren't above at that time? I don't mean all Jewish people, but those who were the leaders. Hey, they weren't above giving a little bit under the table to keep him in chains. But Paul was above giving a little bit under the table in order to get out of chains. God can be very creative when he wants somebody out of chains. You don't have to compromise. If you're in bondage, you don't have to compromise. The Lord can be very creative and effective if he wants to get you out of bondage. All you have to be doing is seeking the Lord, seeking his word, and seeking his direction in your life. I want to end with this point. I just blew by it a second ago so that I could end with it. Now as Paul, verse 25, reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Did you know that that's most people's initial response to the gospel? We start sharing the gospel with people, and the gospel comes in and starts to convict people of sin. You convince them, you tell them about God's standard. You tell them about the necessity of righteousness and our inability to make ourselves righteous. And then you tell them of the coming judgment. Hey, guess what? There's a standard. Guess what? You can never meet it. Guess what? Someday there's going to be a judgment. And if you can't meet the standard, you're going to be judged for all eternity. What is that? That's the gospel. It presents the great human dilemma. How then can I stand right before the Lord? Enter Jesus. Jesus paid the penalty for our sin. He died on a cross, and he rose from the grave. Talk about controversy about resurrection from the dead. He rose from the grave, and he's alive today, believe me. And by this way, which many call a sect, even in Lucille's, I worship the God of my fathers through Jesus Christ. Why? Because I know there's a standard. I know that I fall short. But I know that Jesus bridged the gap between me and God that was impossible for me to bridge. And because I know there is a coming judgment, I said, Lord, I believe. And I'm placing my faith and trust in what Jesus has done for me. Not only so that I will be able to stand and pass the judgment, as it were, because my judgment would have been laid on Jesus at the cross, as it was. But not only that, but also I'll be enabled to do anything you call me to do, because I believe that that same Jesus who rose from the grave rose to go and prepare a place for us. This is the gospel.